Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. Plato's Gorgias is one of his longer dialogues in which Socrates spars with three sophists, one at a time, over whether the good life is the life of the philosopher, or whether one should employ rhetoric to achieve a political outcome favorable to oneself. Other philosophical themes to be examined are the nature of freedom and whether pleasure can be the standard of the good. Gorgias himself is a well-respected sophist from Sicily who settled in Greece after being sent to Athens as an ambassador to ask the Athenians for protection from the Syracusans. Polus and Callicles are represented as pupils of Gorgias. The argument starts with Socrates asking Gorgias what his art is at which he is skillful. He is skillful at the art of rhetoric, and he can teach it to others. So what exactly is rhetoric? Well, we know that weaving is concerned with the making of garments, and music is concerned with the making of melodies. Gorgias says that rhetoric is concerned with discourse, but not all discourse. Since medicine is discourse about disease, Socrates asks why medicine, then, is not rhetoric. Gorgias says that other arts do not count as rhetoric because they have to do with some external action of the hand. Rhetoric acts only through the medium of discourse, and that justifies his statement that rhetoric treats of discourse. And as is typical in Plato's dialogues, we see Socrates asking questions to get at what we would call a clear definition of the thing, a statement of what it essentially is, that will also differentiate it from other things. Socrates asks if it is like arithmetic and geometry, which are arts that depend on language to be effective. Gorgias affirms it, but he does not call those other things rhetoric either. Among the arts that use words, arithmetic is about the subject of numbers. Astronomy tells us about the motions of the stars, sun, and moon. But to what class of things do the words that rhetoric uses relate? What are those words about? Gorgias says it is about the greatest and best of human things. But as is typical in Plato's dialogues, Socrates will reject this answer as not being meaningful. The greatest and best still leaves him in the dark. We may find the physician, the athletic trainer, the money maker, all making the same claim on the basis of the good they do for others. At this point, Gorgias starts making a statement about what he sees as the benefit of his techne, the Greek word that can mean an art, craft, skill, some of which we today might not classify as an art. His techne is greatest because it gives men freedom in their own persons and the power of ruling over others. He poses a question to Socrates. What is there greater than the word which persuades the judges in the courts, or the senators in the council, or the citizens in the assembly or at any political meeting? He explains that anyone with this power of this word can make slaves out of the physicians and the athletic trainers, and cause the money maker to make money for the speaker of this word and not for himself. And so Socrates obtains confirmation of his suspicion that rhetoric is then the artificer of persuasion, specifically an art of producing persuasion. Upon further questioning, Gorgias admits that rhetoric cannot be the only art that is an artificer of persuasion. Teachers of anything, such as arithmetic, are persuading no less, although about a specific thing that is their subject. So what does rhetoric persuade people about? Gorgias says rhetoric is the art of persuasion in the courts of law and other assemblies about what is just and unjust. Now Socrates will begin his shorter questions to bring out what he suspects is wrong here and eventually catch Gorgias in a contradiction. He gets Gorgias to agree that there is such a thing as having learned and such a thing as having believed. But having learned and having believed cannot be the same thing, because it is possible to have a false belief, while there is no such thing as a false knowledge. False knowledge is a contradiction in terms because we can only know what is true. So knowledge and belief must differ. So there must be two sorts of persuasion then. One, the source of belief, and the other, the source of knowledge. Gorgias agrees and answers that the persuasion that rhetoric creates in the courts and other assemblies about the just and unjust is a persuasion that only gives belief. Socrates then asks, so it creates beliefs about the just and unjust, but gives no instruction about them? True. After all, no one can instruct a vast multitude about such high matters of justice in a short time. Socrates says that the meaning of this art is still not totally clear. When assemblies meet and elect a physician, shipwright, or other craftsman, will the rhetorician even be taken into counsel? Socrates thinks not, because when walls, harbors, or docks need to be constructed, the master craftsman will advise. When a new general is needed, the military will advise. Socrates is essentially arguing here that it is experts that can expect to be consulted, and rhetoricians are not recognized as experts. And so, when it comes to young people choosing a teacher, Socrates asks what Gorgias would say about why they should go to him. Gorgias does not accept this, and he retorts back that, in fact, the walls and docks of Athens and the plan of the harbor were done in accordance with the councils, not the builders. The rhetoricians are advisors and are the men who can win their point. Socrates ends up acknowledging that such was the tradition when Themistocles and Pericles ruled, and in those cases the result was marvelous. He says it was the kind of answer he had in mind when asking about the nature of rhetoric. Gorgias further expands on this by explaining, he says, how rhetoric comprehends and holds under her sway all the inferior arts. He says when his brother Herodicus or some other physician had a patient who would not allow him to give medicine or apply the hot iron or knife, Gorgias persuaded the patient by use of rhetoric. And if a rhetorician and a physician were to go to the same city seeking to be elected state physician, the rhetorician has the greater power of getting himself chosen, for he can speak more persuasively to the multitude and on any subject. Such is the nature and power of the rhetorician's art, that Gorgias says he can speak against all men and upon any subject. In short, he can persuade the multitude better than any other man of anything which he pleases. However, as is true of the master of any competitive art, Gorgias says he ought not to abuse his strength. Yet if someone does abuse the strength he gained from a teacher, his teacher is not to blame. Therefore, teachers of rhetoric or of any other art should not, as a result of a former pupil's abuse of power, be detested or banished from the city. For he says they taught their art for a good purpose, to be used against enemies and evildoers, in self-defense, not in aggression. And others have perverted their instructions and turned to a bad use their own strength and skill. His example is of a skilled boxer who beats up his parents. The athletic trainer is not blamed and should not be banished from the city. Neither should the teacher of rhetoric if a former pupil puts it to bad use. Socrates at this point says that he thinks he's detecting something wrong. He asks further questions to which Gorgias assents, that he claims he can make any man a rhetorician and teach him to gain the ears of the multitude. Further, that he can gain a greater power of persuasion than the physician, even in matters pertaining to health. Gorgias says that, yes, he will have that power with the multitude. He concedes to Socrates that this means that the rhetorician will have greater power than he who knows, without being a physician, while he is ignorant of what the physician knows. And so Socrates asks if this means by inference that when the rhetorician is more persuasive than the physician, the ignorant is more persuasive with the ignorant than he who has knowledge? In that case, supposed yes. So here we see at least a limitation on rhetoric, if not something wrong about it. What this means is that when the rhetorician seeks to have influence against an expert on a matter that is in the field of that other person's expertise, it is only with the ignoramuses amongst us that he can be persuasive. Other physicians will know not to listen to the rhetorician about medicine, or at least recognize it when he gets something wrong due to his lack of knowledge. What happens next in the dialogue may be the first of a few shocks to people who are not already desensitized to a kind of brutal honesty and candor. Socrates asks if this holds true of the relation of rhetoric to all the other arts. Is it true that the rhetorician need not know the truth about things, but has only to find a way of persuading the ignorant that he has more knowledge than those who know? And Gorgias responds that this is the great comfort of rhetoric, not to have learned the other arts, but the art of rhetoric only, and yet to be in no way inferior to the professors of them. Here Gorgias has explained his theory of rhetoric as the supreme techne, the art or skill that effectively rules over the others. This is building on his earlier statements that the rhetorician can make the physician his slave or be chosen over him for a post as state physician. His theory is in contrast with that of Plato, who regards philosophy as a kind of architectonic or master foundation of every intellectual endeavor, including attempts to persuade others. As we shall see, it is because rhetoric does not concern itself with discovering the nature of justice or knowledge, as philosophy does. Therefore, rhetoric requires another art, namely philosophy, to ensure it is not put to unjust use. Here is possibly the first time in history that someone will argue that just because we can do something does not mean that we should do it. And in our highly technical and technocratic society, this point is relevant. But going back to the dialogue, Socrates now asks whether the student of rhetoric under Gorgias will be every bit as ignorant of the just and unjust, good and evil, as he is of medicine and the other arts. Does a pupil need to know these things before going to Gorgias? If he is ignorant of them, will Gorgias simply make him seem to the multitude to know, and seem to be a good man? Will Gorgias be unable to teach him? Gorgias responds that if a pupil is ignorant, he will have to teach him. With a few more questions, Gorgias affirms that he who knows carpentry is a carpenter, and he who knows music is a musician. He who has learned is what his knowledge makes him. Likewise, he who has learned what is just will want to do what is just. Gorgias agrees that a just man will not consent to an injustice. According to Gorgias, the rhetorician must be a just man and not will to do an injustice. He is agreeing with one of Plato's more questionable theories, that when a man is unjust, it is due to a cognitive shortfall, that he fails to do good because he does not know the good. And if a man knows what is good, he will do it. Aristotle and many afterwards instead believed that because of, for instance, a weak will, a man can know the good and not do it. But Gorgias was saying before that the teacher of rhetoric should not be held to account if the rhetorician abuses his power and does an injustice. Now he is clearly implying that the rhetorician will never do any injustice. And was it not also said before that rhetoric is the art that is concerned with discourse about the just and unjust? and that Gorgias will teach about justice when necessary? Yes, Gorgias confirms. And so it seems rhetoric both can and cannot lead to an injustice. And Socrates concludes, by the dog, Gorgias, there will be a great deal of discussion before we get at the truth of all this. At this point, Polus steps into the discussion to complain to Socrates about his treatment of Gorgias. He says that it was taking advantage of Gorgias, being too ashamed to deny that the rhetorician knew the just and the good, and said he could teach it to anyone who comes to him ignorant of it. This is how Socrates' question led Gorgias into a contradiction. The truth is, nobody wants to admit that he does not know or cannot teach justice, and Socrates showed a lack of manners in bringing out such an argument. Another way of putting this is to say that Gorgias was being a gentleman and not coming out and saying that rhetoric is not concerned with justice at all, that it is a morally neutral thing. Socrates invites Polus into the debate, and Polus will start by asking Socrates the very question he thought Gorgias was unable to answer. What is rhetoric? What does Socrates think it is anyway? Socrates responds that he thinks rhetoric is a kind of experience, habit, or knack, like cookery, that is intended to produce a delight and gratification. When he talks about cookery here, he means the production of what we would today call quack medicine or snake oil, rather than the work of a chef in a kitchen. It is a knack, not an art. Rhetoric and cookery are parts of the same profession of using bold and ready wit to manage mankind, that he sums up under the title of flattery. The other two parts of flattery are sophistry and tiring. By tiring here, he means clothing in such a way as to flatter and hide imperfection. It can also indicate cosmetics. So we have 4 branches of flattery: sophistry, rhetoric, cookery, and tiring, with 4 different things answering to them. Rhetoric is the ignoble counterfeit of politics. Gorgias interrupts here, asking for a clarification on rhetoric being a counterfeit of politics. Socrates gets him to admit that both bodies and souls exist that can be in good or in bad health. Also, either body or soul can appear to be in good health when in reality not in good health. He then explains that body and soul each have 2 arts attending to them. The art of the soul is politics, and there is another pertaining to the body that has no name, but has 2 divisions of medicine and gymnastic. Given the 4 arts, 2 for the soul and 2 for the body, flattery, guessing their natures, distributes herself into 4 shams or simulations of them. They have no regard for man's highest interests. They instead bait men with pleasures and deceive men into believing they are of value. Cookery, for example, creates a disguise of medicine, and Socrates refuses to call an irrational thing such as this an art rather than a knack, because it cannot explain its own applications and cannot really be taught. It is a skill without logos, without its justification in discourse. Likewise, tiring is flattery taking the form of gymnastic, making men affect a spurious beauty. Tiring is flattery of gymnastics, cookery is flattery of medicine, sophistry is flattery of legislation, and rhetoric is flattery of justice. And the difference between sophistry and rhetoric is that sophistry is to legislation as rhetoric is to justice. Sophistry leads to corrupt and bad legislation, as rhetoric leads to unjust punishment or unjust preferences of citizens. Now Polus is surprised by all this, and asks Socrates if he believes that the good rhetoricians are meanly regarded on the idea that they are flatterers. Socrates says they are not regarded at all. But Polus asks, well, do they not have great power in states? And Socrates responds that if power is something good to the possessor, rhetoricians do not have it. In that case, they will have the least power of all the citizens. Now, in Polus's mind, he is hearing nonsense. What could Socrates have in mind when he says that rhetoricians in reality have no power, if power is a good? He tells Socrates that good rhetoricians are like tyrants. They kill, despoil, and exile anyone they please. And so Socrates clarifies this a little when he says, I tell you, Polus, that rhetoricians and tyrants have the least possible in states, as I was just now saying. For they do literally nothing which they will, but only what they think best. Polus shows that he is not understanding this by asking if that's not a great power. So let's look at it. What Plato is doing here is drawing a distinction between two kinds of freedom. Polus is thinking only in terms of the negative kind of freedom that is also associated with modern liberalism. It is a liberty to do as one sees fit, without interference by a state or society that may seek to impose a morality. But one can draw a distinction between what one sees himself wanting and what he really wants. And this is not a matter of one kind of freedom that may sometimes imply a responsibility. It is consistent with the idea that politics is the art pertaining to the soul, and the idea that the just state can make citizens better people by edifying their souls. This is meant to be contradictory to the idea that we should be allowed to do as we wish, when it may not be good for ourselves. John Stuart Mill has, for example, in his book on liberty in the 19th century, taken the position that a policeman may be justly punished for being drunk on duty, but no man should be punished just for being drunk. Here in Plato is an idea being developed of positive freedom, under which the state can make someone truly free by imposing temperance on anyone getting drunk and forcing them to be free for the well-being that is what we really want. Specifically here, for the tyrant, what he wills and what he thinks best will be shown to be different things. He does not primarily will to exile a dissonant or even to silence him. Either way, that is a means to an end, not the end itself. He is doing what he thinks best. Polus has never thought of any other kind of freedom or power other than the negative kind, and he needs clarification. Socrates first obtains confirmation from Polus that he does, in fact, believe that power is a good to he who has it. And then he asks, well, if a fool does what he thinks best, but is mistaken about what is best, this is a good, that is a great power? Well, Polus says no. So now, according to Socrates, Polus is called upon to prove that the rhetorician is not a fool, and that rhetoric is a real techne and not flattery. Polus does not accept that Socrates is given good reason to believe that rhetoric is flattery. He insists that if a tyrant is doing what he thinks best, then he is doing what he wills, for he thinks the two are the same thing. Socrates affirming one and denying the other is monstrous and absurd. But Polus will give more answers in order to have Socrates explain what he means, and Socrates now begins his construction of his argument that when a man does what he thinks is best, he does not do what he wills. When a man who, at the bidding of his physician, takes a painful medicine for the sake of his health, he does not will what he does in particular. He rather wills that further end of his health for the sake of which he acts. The businessman risking a voyage wills the wealth for the sake of which he goes on the voyage. And is it not universally true? If a man does something for the sake of something else, he wills that something else, not what he does. Polus agrees to this. All things are good or evil, or intermediate and indifferent. Wisdom, health, wealth are goods, and their opposites are evil. Sitting, walking, running, sailing, wood, stones, are not good or evil in themselves, but when these indifferent things are done or used, it is the indifferent done for the sake of the good, not the good done to benefit the indifferent. If we kill a man, exile him, or despoil him of his property, it is because we think it will be conducive to our good. But we admitted before that when we do something for the sake of something else, we do not will what we do. Therefore, when we kill or exile a man or despoil him of his goods, we must be willing what is conducive to our good, or we would not will it at all. This could be put into a simpler hypothetical syllogism. If we abuse a man, then we think what we do will benefit us. If we think what we will do will benefit us, then we do not will what we do. Therefore, if we abuse a man, then we do not will what we do. And this is a deductively valid form of reasoning. Polus admits to this and asks about another inference that Socrates wants to draw. When a tyrant or rhetorician kills, exiles, or despoils, thinking it is in his interest when it is not, he could still be said to be doing what seems best to him. Further, under the presumption that nobody knowingly wills what is evil, he does not do what he wills if he does what is evil. If this great power is a good, then the tyrant therefore does not have a great power. Therefore, a man may do what seems good for him in his state, while neither doing what he wills nor having great power. So what this shows here is that the tyrant really does not have the power to do what he wills if it can lead to evil, and thus that cannot be a great power. Polus will still continue to argue, not yet ready to concede to Socrates that there may be something wrong with rhetoric and that the life of philosophy is superior. He still believes, for instance, that the tyrant is the happiest man, and he will respond accordingly. He will continue to argue, and the result will be a short interlude in which 3 disagreements between them will come out for future discussion. The disagreements will be about positions Socrates will take that Polus finds counterintuitive. That it is preferable to suffer an injustice than to do an injustice, that it is preferable to be punished for having done an injustice, and that the unjust man is more miserable than the just man. And I will provide a summary of them shortly. And we have it, a nice one, starting with Polus saying, "You are maintaining a strange doctrine, Socrates. I shall try to make you agree with me, O my friend, for as a friend I regard you. Then these are the points at issue between us, are they not? I was saying that to do is worse than to suffer injustice." "Exactly so." "And you said the opposite." "Yes." "I said also that the wicked are miserable, and you refuted me?" "By Zeus, I did." "In your own opinion, Polus." "Yes, and I rather suspect that I was in the right." "You further said that the wrongdoer is happy if he be unpunished." "Certainly. And I affirm that he is most miserable, and that those who are punished are less miserable. Are you going to refute this proposition also?" "A proposition which is harder of refutation than the other, Socrates." Each of these disagreements will be dealt with, starting with the contention of Socrates that it is preferable to suffer an injustice than to do an injustice. This is a hard sell, I think, with anyone, including me, but it will have to do with the doer of an injustice being marked by a moral disgrace that is not imposed upon an innocent victim. Going back to the debate, Polus starts by pointing out that if a man is detected in an unjust attempt to make himself a tyrant, he may be racked, mutilated, or have his eyes burnt out. Would he be happier under those circumstances than he would be if he escaped such punishment, ruled and obtained the admiration of citizens and strangers? Polus asks if this is some paradox that Socrates claims cannot be refuted. Socrates retorts that Polus is raising hobgoblins instead of refuting him. Did Polus not ask specifically about when someone acts in an unjust attempt to make himself a tyrant? He affirms he did. So the answer from Socrates is that neither the tyrant who succeeds or the would-be tyrant who is punished would be happier, but the more miserable of the two is the one who escapes punishment and subsequently rules. Polus once again resorts to the appeal to the bandwagon, challenging Socrates to ask the company around him if his ideas are shared by them. Of course, Socrates will not accept that as a refutation, but in this case he actually thinks that we all really do believe that to do an injustice is worse than suffering one, and that it is better to be punished after having done an injustice. Polus says that it is worse to suffer an injustice, but agrees that doing an injustice is a greater disgrace. So is the disgrace a greater evil? Polus will not agree at this point because he does not assume or believe that the honorable or disgraceful is the same as the good or evil. However, Socrates has a way of overcoming this objection. He argues that when we speak of beautiful things, colors, figures, sounds, institutions, we call them beautiful by some standard. For instance, we call bodies beautiful in proportion as they are useful, or as their sight gives pleasure to the spectator. The same can be said of music, figures, and colors. Laws and institutions, similarly, have no beauty except insofar as they are useful, pleasant, or both. Deformity or disgrace may be equally measured by the opposite standard of evil or pain. When an object exceeds another in its beauty, it exceeds it in utility, in pleasure, or both. Likewise, of two deformed things, one that exceeds the other in deformity or disgrace will exceed the other in evil, pain, or both. Polus agrees to all of this. Socrates now concludes from this that if doing wrong is more disgraceful than suffering it, it must exceed the suffering of a wrong in evil, in pain, or both. Now we consider pain and evil as separate items. The injurers do not suffer more pain, so they must suffer more evil. For if they do not exceed in one, they must exceed in the other. Now Polus agrees that doing an injustice will have an excess of evil, and will therefore be a greater evil than suffering an injustice. Since a greater evil or greater dishonor is not preferable to a lesser one, both conclude that no man would really rather do an injustice than to suffer it. Next comes the argument from Socrates that it is a lesser evil to be punished for an unjust act than to escape punishment. First, he gets Polus to assent that to suffer punishment is another name for being justly corrected, and that therefore it is useful and insofar as it is just, it is also honorable. In this case, a patient is suffering from what an agent does. If a man strikes, there is something that is being stricken. The suffering to him who is stricken is of the same nature as the act of him who strikes. It is the same with imprisonment or imposition of a fine. Universally, the action of the patient answers to the action of the agent, in this case, the punished and the punisher. The agent is acting justly, and the punished suffers justly. If it is just and honorable, it is also the suffering of what is good. Polus continues to agree, then, that he is benefited. This will mean that he who is justly punished has his soul improved and is delivered from the evil in his soul. Polus goes on to agree that of the various evils of the body and soul, namely disease, poverty, and injustice, the most disgraceful is the evil of the soul, which is injustice. Socrates claims it is the most disgraceful because it is the most painful or hurtful or both. However, Polus will not at first agree that to be unjust, intemperate, cowardly, and ignorant is more painful than being sick or poor. He says the greater painfulness does not seem to follow from the premises. Socrates then points out that Polus has already agreed that the evil of the soul is the most disgraceful of all evils. What exceeds most in hurtfulness will be the greatest of evils associated with an excess of disgrace. Injustice, intemperance, in general the depravity of the soul is the greatest of evils. Polus is now agreeing. Now, money-making is the art that can deliver us from poverty, and medicine is the art that can free us of disease. For the deliverance from vice and injustice, we need those who are to punish us in accordance with some rule of justice. Of these arts, money-making, medicine, and justice, it is justice that gives us the greatest pleasure or advantage, or both. Now, as we have already seen with medicine, being healed is not always pleasant, but can be useful. Socrates says it is also the case with punishment. So he continues his analogy with medicine into his conclusions. It would be the happier man who was never out of health than he who was healed. Likewise, happiness consists in never having evils in the soul. But of two men having evils in the soul, the one who has been delivered from his evil will be happier than he who has no deliverance from his injustice. And so he concludes, telling Polus, he lives worst who commits the greatest crimes, and who, being the most unjust of men, succeeds in escaping rebuke or correction or punishment. And this, as you say, has been accomplished by Archelaus and other tyrants and rhetoricians and potentates. Socrates then states that such men are analogous to the person afflicted with the worst of disease, but will not be cured because, like a child, he is afraid of the pain of being burned or cut. Now Polus has agreed to the three positions that Socrates took previously, namely, that it is a greater evil to do an injustice than to suffer one, that it is a greater evil to escape punishment for having done an injustice, and that the tyrants are actually the most miserable of men. This last point seems to logically follow after the previous two have been accepted. Once Socrates has stated these conclusions, he then goes on to elaborate on what he sees as the importance of punishment under his concept of the judge as a kind of soul doctor. He says that if we ever firstly ourselves, or have family or friends who have done wrong, we should bring it to light and seek justice even against ourselves, so that the wrongdoers can suffer in hope of obtaining the good and honorable. As is the case with the pain of some useful medicine, we should also bring our crimes to light, even when the penalty for the crime may be whipping, a fine, imprisonment, exile, or even execution. By contrast, should we wish to harm an enemy, the way to do so would be to help ensure that he escapes detection and punishment for his wrongdoing, in order to bring about the situation where his soul continues to be corrupt. In either case, it is here where Socrates says rhetoric can be useful, to persuade authorities to bring about or not bring about justice. In either case, he concludes the discussion with Polus by saying that the importance of rhetoric is of small, if of any use to him who is not intending to commit injustice. This concludes the section with Polus, and before going on, maybe we could ask if you agree with Socrates. As I said, he has before him a hard sell. As for myself, I don't think he has proven that it is worse to do rather than to suffer an injustice. Doing it may be more of a disgrace, but I do not accept it to be more evil than the pain and humiliation of suffering an injustice. Socrates will argue later that pain and evil are not the same, and even he will say there are good and bad pains. In my mind, labeling a disgrace more evil because he who does an injustice suffers less pain is just working around a proper comparison. The assumption was that since disgrace is not more physically painful, it must be more evil. I could make the same argument about the humiliation of being the victim of an injustice and having fellow citizens automatically believing the false but official story. It's not more physically painful, so it must be more evil. As for seeking just punishment, even if what is said here is correct, we should not expect just punishment in an unjust state, in which the goal of state punishment is not to be the doctor of the soul anyway. And since the soul is not believed by Socrates to be a material thing like the body, I question the viability of his analogy. Well, that's all for part 1 of 2. If you liked it, please hit like and subscribe. Check out my other videos. Thanks for watching.